few days ago, Devon LARRATT went on to the Lion Pride Arm Wrestling podcast, and in this podcast, he explained exactly what happened in this round 2, and really in rounds 2 through 3 against Levan, or rather in rounds 2, 3, and 4 against Levan Saginishvili at East versus West 12. So basically, if you guys don't remember, what happened is that in the very first round, Devon looks really, really great. He completely stops Levan right in the center table. And I think pretty much everyone, including Ingen, including Hermes, probably the vast majority of the people watching, are thinking that Devon's going to win that match. It looks like he's stonewalling Levan right in the center of the table. But then, immediately after this in the following rounds, this happens. Levan just completely destroys Devon. It looks super, super easy. So Devon explained exactly what happened, and that is that in the very first round, Levan used a completely different technique or a different strategy than he did in the later rounds. So it looks like in round 1, Levan was basically trying to test himself, kind of get an idea of how strong Devon was, and he essentially tries to contain, or he tried to hold on to Devon's top roll and do more of a lat drag pressure and just use his wrist flexion to simply directly fight Devon's pronation and basically just destroy it, just bend his wrist against Devon's pronation. If Levan could have done that, if he could have literally just bent his wrist directly against Devon's top roll, that would have been one of the craziest things I've ever seen. That would have been just an insane amount of wrist flexion, an insane amount of cupping strength. But as we know, he was unable to do that, which is very impressive from Devon. Levan obviously has one of the strongest cups ever, probably the strongest cup in history. So if Levan is trying to contain you and you can prevent that from happening, even that is impressive. But what happens immediately after this, all that Levan does is he just changes up his strategy, and now he is no longer holding on, and all that he cares about is this high knuckle. And you'll notice how this time around, what Levan does a lot more so in rounds 2 through 4 is he's doing much more of a pivoting pressure. And you can see this high knuckle position. He's rolling over the top of Devon. So he is no longer holding on to Devon whatsoever. He's simply punching right over the top of Devon with that high knuckle. And he's putting a really high emphasis on that during the setup. He gets a much higher index knuckle than he did the last time, and maybe even a higher index knuckle than Devon does on the setup. And this is what allows him to go up and over the top. And you can just see it that Devon never really gets any kind of purchase here once Levan changes to this different technique. Now, another thing that's interesting that you can see here, and I remember when this match happened, this is pretty much, that was my take on it, is that I think Levan just switched up his technique. He tried to cup Devon in round 1. It didn't work. He had to flop press. And then in rounds 2 through 4, he just essentially did a Todd roll where he didn't really care as much about his wrist. And he was just going up and over the top. However, Devon said something a little bit more specific that I did find to be very interesting. And that was, Devon said that he didn't actually crack Levan's wrist right here, because you'll notice when Levan's wrist is at the very bottom, you can see this little angle right there. It looks like Levan's wrist is cracked back. And I thought essentially Levan was just top rolling no matter what. He was just going to go back and up into the side, and he just didn't care what happened to his wrist. But Devon explained a little bit more of a nuance. He said that Levan, or at least what he felt, is that he did not take Levan's wrist and Levan just kept going, but rather Levan may have even been intentionally kicking his own wrist back. And this is something that can make it a little bit easier to go up and over the top of your opponents. And what's even more interesting is that this is what Devon often does. So in this podcast, what Devon said is that Levan basically did his own move to him. So Levan essentially did the move that Devon normally does, where he kicks his own wrist back, he rises up and over the top and forces people to hold on to him. That's essentially what Levan did to Devon. And I just think this is super, super cool, because Levan is one of the only people at this level that I've seen do this. Oftentimes when you're so strong, it can be kind of scary to start letting go of certain strengths. You want to just dominate every single area. You want to have your cup, you want to have your shoulder commitment, your side pressure, your back pressure, everything locked in. And then you want to just destroy your opponent. But it can take a lot of courage to give up one of your fundamentals like this on purpose in order to gain a different fundamental. And Levan, what it sounds like Devon is saying is that Levan intentionally gave up his cup just a little bit, right off the go. And he did this in order to gain his radial deviation, or in order to gain height, in order to force Devon to hold on to him. And you can see in those later rounds just how effective it is. Levan goes up and over the top of Devon, and now Devon is the one that's going underneath Levan and essentially having to hold on and having to try to lat drag as Levan is opening Devon's bicep. He's lowering Devon's hand height. Levan's hand height is increasing in relation to Devon's. So I just think this was a super cool thing. I don't think that there's anyone else in the super heavyweight category that's maybe top 10 that would be comfortable doing this. I think potentially Levan might actually be the number 2 guy in the super heavyweights as far as technique goes, at least in certain areas. I don't think I've seen anyone else that was comfortable giving the wrist up like this, doing this almost kind of like a gambit in chess, is the way that Devon refers to it, where you're giving something away in order to get something else. So I just thought this was super cool that Levan is doing something so technically advanced. It's normally a technique you would expect from the weaker guy, but Levan is the strongest guy in the world, and he's doing these techniques that give him such an advantage. So I just think this is super cool that we have someone at the very top of the sport that is like this. Not only is he the strongest arm wrestler we've ever had, but he's also one of the very most technical, I believe. So one other just really cool principle that I would like to mention is the idea of bending your wrist will essentially make the match back into the lane of arm power. So if the wrists are flat, then a lot of the match is going to be determined by the hand and by the wrist strength. And it's going to put the majority of the match, the majority of the power into that area. And of course, by bending your wrist, you're going to kind of alleviate that pressure, and you're going to make it more about the arm again. However, I think something that a lot of people don't think about is you don't actually have to bend your wrist forward. You don't have to bend it as in flexing it or as in cupping your wrist. But you can also bend your wrist by extending it, by kicking it back, or by letting it flop back. And you're essentially doing the same thing. So in other words, whether you cup your wrist in or whether you extend your wrist, whether you flop your wrist, you're still putting the match back into the arm. You're putting the emphasis back on the arm either way. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't think about. This is something Todd Hutchings does extremely well. He realized a long time ago he's not going to be able to bend his wrist against these high-level top rollers. There's no way that he's going to hook them. But he can achieve essentially the same thing by just bending his wrist in the opposite way. Whether he cups his wrist or whether he extends his wrist, he still puts the match back into the arm. And I think that that's what Levan essentially did here, is he let his wrist go just a little bit, and then he rose up and over the top, and this put the match back into the arm. It gave him his access to his elbow flexor, and he rose up and over the top of Devon LARRATT. And Devon didn't really have any kind of access to attack Levan's hand because of this. Maybe he would have been able to crack Levan's hand if Levan just sat there and tried to keep his wrist flat. Maybe this would have looked different. But Levan has the technical capacity to allow that wrist to crack back just slightly, or even give it away on purpose in order to take high ground and put the match back into the arm where it needs to be for Levan to win. Let me know what you guys think about this. Is this what you thought was going on live when it happened way back in the day? Like I said, I thought this was essentially what was happening. However, I didn't realize that Levan was actually giving his wrist away on purpose. I did think that he was having it taken and just didn't care. But Devon said that he actually was giving it away on purpose. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you later.